Go live. All right, I think we are here. We're Adam. We'll allow a couple more minutes before so some folks can tune in. Like and share as you may see fit. All righty, 1 p.m. Let's try and be as punctual as possible. First time ever in Indian country. Kidoki. So Ayuki Hudkij, Nani Ara. Hello, how are you, my people? Nani Tui Charlie Reed. My name is Charlie Reed. I'm a peer mentor at Two Feathers Native American Family Services. I'm also a graduate student at Humboldt State in the Environment and Community Social Science program. And I am here today to start off our first virtual Indigenous People Speaker Series. But before we get into that, I just want to thank you for joining. And our thoughts and prayers are with you all in these trying times. Just remember that we are capable and resilient. These times challenge us to show just how resilient we can be. And one of the ways that Two Feathers as an organization is being responsive to this crisis is by having virtual speaker series such as the one today. And I think it's really great. I think it's powerful just how much we can come together in these times, in these uncharted times. I don't think anyone could have ever thought of being in a situation like this, but seeing how adaptable we can be gives me hope that we'll get through this in no time. So please social distance yourself. It's only a couple weeks, unless we make it longer than it has to be. And so for those of you, I know we have a lot of viewers who are supposed to tune in. So for those of you who don't know what Two Feathers is, Two Feathers Native American Family Services is a nonprofit organization in the Humboldt County and north coast of California, Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot people. And we also are very close vicinity of the Hupa, Yurok, Karuk, and Talawa people. So, very nice presence of Indigenous people. So yeah, a little bit about us is we primarily serve Native American families to meet the needs of our community. Oftentimes, these are families with low socioeconomic status and people who kind of need a little bit more support. And so I think the unique thing about Two Feathers' work is that they include a lot of cultural programming. So they kind of incorporate fun activities with cultural relative activities. And so that's really important, especially when we're trying to revitalize the social health of our people as well as our culture. I think that's two birds with one stone. And another part of it too is we have a Mentorship Academy where we have Native college students, high school students such as myself, kind of mentoring high school, elementary age kids to kind of get them equipped for life skills, social skills, cultural skills. The list goes on. I think that's something that's really good about what we do is that it's providing job opportunities for college students while also giving back to the youth to make sure that they have just as much of an opportunity as we do. And also there's a clinical behavioral health sector in the Two Feathers Native American Family Services organization, which I think meets the medical needs that some of the families we serve have. And so that's something that's really the next step as far as programming. And also victim advocacy programs. And I think that's really important to, have an agency that supports us and advocates from a professional standpoint, because oftentimes, social services kind of fall short to some of the needs that our families have. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of a brief background of what we do at Two Feathers, and enough about Two Feathers. And now what we're all here for is Dr. Cutcha Risling Baldy. She's a very personal mentor to me. She has been the person who kind of believed in me academically, and now I am a graduate student because of her in some ways. So I'm very grateful for her. She's also the chairperson of the Native American Studies Department at HSU, Humboldt State University. And she's also a Hoopa tribal member. She also has lineage with the Karuk and Yurok people as well. So without further ado, Cutcha.
I hope everyone can hear me, and I think you can let Charlie know if you can't hear me or if anything's happening with the connection wise. I'm, I guess, live streaming. This is kind of one of my first times doing this, so I'm a little bit, my first, let's see, my first time of trying to maneuver this whole Zoom thing. So you see I got my fancy background, which puts me right smack dab in the middle of the Hoopa Valley, which is where I'm from. And can't be at right now, but you know, like someday we'll get back there really soon. And I love Hoopa. It's a really important healing place. I'm Dr. Cutcha Risling Baldy, and I'm really excited, I guess, to start off this potential Indigenous speaker series for Two Feathers. I'm fortunate enough to work with Two Feathers as part of their ACORN program, which is a youth wellness program. And have been doing that for the past few years, and am really honored that how they continue to find new ways to engage people in our cultures, but also in our histories and in our communities, and to kind of inspire people for what we could do as Native people with the future of our generations. And the vision that they've had in that, I think, has been really important for me as a scholar, because I'm able to not just do work as an academic, but as somebody who's actually in the community working with youth and with elders and with people, and thinking about how the work that I do can actually be helpful and of service to Native people. So Two Feathers is an amazing organization. And I hope that if you are just logging in for the first time to Two Feathers, that you take a moment to learn more about them and what they do, and ways that you can sort of support the work that they do. I'm gonna start sharing my screen, and Charlie and I practiced this, so I'm hoping that it works out well. Ooh, can everybody see? I hope everybody can see. So I'm up here like in the little corner now, I think. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what it did. Okay, I'm gonna
click the presenter view. That'd be like full screen of your.
I'm gonna make it big. There. Awesome.
Good.
So I'm going to talk a little bit today about resiliency, and the title of the talk being, you know, Resilient Histories for Resilient Futures. I know that right now we're in a really unprecedented time, and that it can feel very overwhelming to be at home and not know what's going to happen next, and seeing what's coming out constantly. I'm always like reading the news and watching what's going on, and I keep having to remind myself to sort of take deep breaths and to be in place, and to think about the sort of positivity and the possibility for our futures, especially as Indigenous peoples. And I think that we are very community driven, and sometimes being forced to, you know, shelter in place and not be able to come together with each other has reminded us that also we need to take time for meditation and concentration. And I wanted to do a talk today that really kind of lets everyone out there know that, you know, our histories are histories of resilience, and our present and our future is also going to be about resilience, and it's going to be about what's possible. And I look forward to the fact that there's so much possibility in what we're living. And I hope that everybody kind of is reminded of that. And I do that through history because I think it's important for people to know. I know that we don't get taught a lot about, especially California Indian history, in our classrooms in California. I know that what that means usually is that people question when they come into my classroom, and they start to think, are you telling me the truth? Because I've never heard about this before. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna start here. This past year, the Wiyot tribe had their island, their place of world renewal, returned to them from the city of Eureka. It was unprecedented, covered by international news media, because it was the first time that we are able to find that a city had returned land to a tribe. I think often about this day. I think that a lot of us in this region do now. I listened that day to Wiyot peoples talk about the importance of the return of this land. I listened to Wiyot youth who were singing songs as part of a brush dance demonstration. I remember how our community came together to celebrate this moment of this return of this sacred space, but also the idea that we were finally moving in a direction that not just acknowledged Native people, but understood that real action is how we're going to reconcile. It's how we're going to develop what could be like a reconciliation process. I think that one thing that I was really reminded of from this day is how much singing happened. And I love thinking about the ways in which the young people were wearing dresses and they were participating in what was going on. And there was actually a dress that was worn by a young Wiyot tribal member that I recognized as the dress of Michelle Hernandez, who's a woman from the Wiyot tribe. And she had that dress in her 2014 women's coming of age ceremony for the Wiyot people, which they had done prior to the return of the island. And so you see just this moment of revitalization and resurgence coming all together for people who had worked for years, decades to make this return happen. I like to start here because people might tend to start when they talk about Tuluwat with the massacre. And so they would really look at this idea of that there was in 1860 a massacre of Wiyot people on what they came to refer to as Indian Island. I actually don't refer to, or try not to refer to Tuluwat as Indian Island. I grew up in this region and I always learned about Indian Island. My mother was a historian, or she is a historian. She loves taking me places and teaching me about history. And she would always tell us about the landscape that surrounded us and what had happened to people. And I think a lot of people, if they're thinking about Tuluwat, they would think about it as a place of a massacre, because that's how most people come to learn about it. On February 26, 1860, citizens of Humboldt County showed up to massacre Wiyot people. And the Wiyot people at the time were in world renewal. So they were doing a ceremony to pray for the health and well-being of the community and the world. Humboldt County citizens came with hatchets and knives, and they murdered mostly Indian women and children. And this was the last time that the Wiyot performed a world renewal ceremony on Tuluwat until 2014, when the Wiyot held its first world renewal ceremony in over 150 years on the island. So I know that resurgence is possible and that revitalization is happening, and that coming out of this history is now these really powerful moments of a reconnection and a re-indigenization, that's what's going to empower us into our futures. I always tell people, like, we're not going to solve these issues. We're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to solve the things that we're facing today. We're not going to look at how we're going to change what's happening with our most vulnerable populations, our most marginalized, without Indigenous peoples and without Indigenous knowledges and without Indigenous ceremony. And we cannot protect our earth. We can't move forward if we don't acknowledge the sacredness of the earth. It's not going to happen. So I think that the revitalization of these ceremonies that are reconnecting us are so important. And I always begin here telling that story because, again, I don't want people to just think of this island as a place of a massacre. The thing that I remember a lot when I learned about Tuluwat is that at the end of the massacre on Tuluwat, there was a woman who they found. She was one of the only survivors, and they say that she was stuck in the mud, unable to run or move away from the bodies of her people or her family or her friends or those that she had just slept next to a short time before, with the warm embrace of a fire or comforted by sleep in the safe, peaceful feelings of this night of ceremony. She was found that morning after the massacre, and when they found her, she was singing a song. Now, musicologists have described our songs as cries. If you look in some of the documentation, they talk about us as wailing. They say that we cry for luck and that the melody carries out from very deep in our chests. I think of it as echoing. It's like an echoing movement that tries to get to the mountaintops or beyond this world. And if you close your eyes, I think the way that we sing, it's to get up, to go further. So this woman, this Wiyot woman, she was stuck in the mud, and when they found her, she was singing. In my life, I've been told that there were some songs where the earth itself would shake and the ground would rumble, and Native people we used to sing for everything. We would sing in the morning when we woke up, and we would say thank you for the day. And then when we brought life into the world, we would sing. And when we put the world back into balance, we would sing. And when we wanted to make people laugh, we would sing. And if we wanted to heal people, we would sing. And when we cooked, or when we wove, or when we fell in love, we would sing. And we sang something more than words. Academics like to call these things vocables, but they're more like our language of rhythm. They are a physical manifestation of our heartbeat, or a river, or the flight that the woodpecker takes, or the sound that you make when something is good or is about to happen that is good, or the sound that you make after you've laughed so much that you can barely take in a breath. That's how we sing. So I think about how on that day after the sun rose on Tuluwat, even after this massacre, there was this woman and she was singing. Now, Cheryl Seidner, who's a Wiyot medicine person and a former tribal chair, says that she thinks that it was a mourning song, like an MOURNING, a song for her people, a way to send them off into the next world. And I marvel at the strength of that, of our people, of our women, to be amongst those who had screamed out into the night and who likely begged for their lives or their children's lives, to be stuck and unable to move. And there you look around and you think, I have to sing for them to send them off to begin to heal this place. There is a power there that reverberates from the land itself. And this is what began to heal this place. There is a power to our songs and what they carry forward. And sometimes I think about how for a long time, I don't think we felt like we had a lot of songs to sing. And I remember that at this point of utter destruction and depravity, there was a song, and that is who we are as Indian people. So I never begin or end my presentations with genocide. I begin and end with us, because we are still here and we are still singing, and we have always been singing, and we have never stopped. So I mull over lately who we center when we come into these spaces to share a lot of our very hard fought and very often liberatory knowledge. It's labor intensive knowledge that we do as Native people, because I live this work in my body. I think about this a lot when I'm doing this work. Historians write all these books and articles debating whether genocide is a term that should be used or applied to like what's happening here in California. This year actually marks the, sorry, it just went out. This year actually marks the 40th anniversary of genocide in Northwest California, which was written by Jack Norton, who's a Hoopa and Cherokee historian. It was published in 1979. And he named what happened to California Indians as genocide. And he used the settler archives to show that what happened was egregious, but also legally sanctioned by the state of California. At the time when he wrote this, so many people freaked out. And so they started to sort of say that his work couldn't be included in various places. And he wrote about how people were angry. They accused him of being biased. And he actually said that he said to them, yes, I am biased because all historians are biased, but I am not angry. And he noted that in some public school districts, they would not allow this book about the genocide of California Indians in their libraries. So after his work in 1979, the work of establishing the genocide in California became primarily about historians looking through the archives to try to figure out how they could show that what had happened in California was a genocide. In 2012, Brendan Lindsay published Murder State, California's Native American Genocide. And in 2009, Benjamin Madley had published, 2019, I think it was, he published An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. This has now become a best-selling book, The American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. It was recommended by Governor Jerry Brown as a book that people should read. It was written about in national newspapers like the Los Angeles and New York Times. So what has become obvious from this past 40 years of work is that California used genocide as the foundation for claims to land, water, and resources, and effectively reducing our claims to land, water, and resources. And their claim seems to, I mean, most California citizens would have to say that their claim comes down to, we killed everybody who was here, so now it's ours. But I like to speak to people on this very logical level that you can't claim land, you can't claim water, and you can't claim resources if the way you got it is killing everybody that had it first. When we start to apply this to land claims or water rights, we start to talk about how you have to give stolen land back to indigenous peoples, honor or look at honor taxes, return cultural items from museums. A lot of people get really scared by me coming in and being like, oh, you have to give all the land back. Like that's the only way that this is going to work. And you might have to have accountability to this genocide, because the only way in which you're able to come into ownership of any of those things is because of genocide. A lot of people can't really imagine what that looks like. So I spend a lot of time now, and I travel to many places, and my job is to sort of show up into groups of people and be like, they say, what should we do? What should we do for Native people? And then I take the microphone and I say, give all the land back. That's it. And then they kind of look at me funny, and I'm like, no, you just have to give it all back. And then they go, well, how am I supposed to do that? And then I say, well, I don't know, just like give it back, like now. And there was one talk that I went to give where I was pointing out that when we do land acknowledgements, we can't use them as excuses. We can't say like, oh, I did a land acknowledgement, so now I'm good. I don't need to worry about sort of the other things happening with Native people. And when I try to explain things to people, I'm like, no, a land acknowledgement isn't really anything. You have to give the land back because you stole it. It's hard for people to understand at first, but I do a lot of talks about it now, trying to help people to understand that there is possibility in what this could look like, this decolonial process, like decolonization. But until we start talking about it and envisioning it, it's not ever going to happen. And so we need to start saying out loud that giving land back is possible. And I don't make excuses anymore, because the idea is if something else was stolen from you and you knew the person that had it, you would go and be like, give it back to me. So I see in possibility the fact that people have an opportunity now to make real what decolonization could look like. And so when people ask me after I start going like, oh, you should give all your land back, I went to, where did I go? Oh, I went to Bioneers, and I was sitting in front of all these people, and they were like, what should we do for Indian people? And I was like, give your land back. And then they were all, I don't even know what that looks like. And I was like, well, you could just give it back. But if you don't know how to start that process, you should think about what that could be. You should start to think about what that looks like for you. And what I say to people now is, oh, you don't know what land return looks like? Well, it looks like this. They just gave all the land back to the Wiyot for Tuat. So just do that, because it's already happened. So I know that this is like an unprecedented time in history, that when we think about how it's genocide that made it so that people could own this land and feel like they own this water and own these resources, then when we start talking about what that looks like in the future, it looks like land return. That's what it is. Because there is no environmental justice or social justice or racial justice or food justice or climate justice until there is land return. You can do work, you can do all kinds of good work, but work has to address indigenous dispossession. So you have to return the land. Then the work with tribal peoples, you can continue on the land that is theirs. And it looks like this. And I can say that from being there, it's so beautiful. The thing I realized about being in that space is decolonization and land return is so freaking beautiful and happy. And there was these moments amongst people in community where you could see true partnership and building of coalition, because finally people are starting to think about what decolonization really looks like. I always say, like, along with this movement and the thing that we need to think about, there are no more settler excuses for not returning land, because it's already happening. It's happening everywhere. So I know that there is a lot that people don't know about California history, and I always like when people invite me to do like California Indian history talks, because they'll be like, can you give me all of California Indian history in like 20 minutes? And I always say like, oh, you want, 15,000 years of history in 20 minutes? It's going to be difficult. But we have tried to make a lot of resources available so that people can start to think about how they learn about California Indian history. There's a lot that people don't know because it's not something that people usually teach in schools. Some things people usually don't know is that there were close to 1 million people in California prior to what contact with settlers. It's the largest population north of Mexico. They're able to estimate an account of people via documentation by settlers like the Spanish, but this number, 310,000, highly underestimates groups of people, especially in the Northern California region. So 310,000 is likely the number that you will hear quoted the most by historians or people that are writing, because it's the number that's been the most firmly established by documentation. Although most people doing the work say it was closer to 1 million. What they also know is that by 1900, there was less than 20,000 people. So between 1769 and 1900, you're talking about at least a reduction of 90% of the population. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened between 1769 and 1900 to have this massive reduction in population of California Indians. Some good news, in 2010, the census reported that there were close to 720,000 people, like Native people living in California. We're now about 1.7% of the population. If you look at Humboldt County, we're actually closer to 6% of the population in Humboldt County. This is a significant population when you're considering that in the state of California, you're talking about 1.7%, and in Humboldt County, you're talking about 6%. We have the three largest tribes in our region, the Hoopa Valley tribe, the Yurok tribe, and the Karuk tribe. And we also have some of the largest land holdings that are Indian land in the state of California. Where I'm lecturing from today is in Wiyot country. Wiyot territory includes the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. Many of our largest populated areas in Humboldt County are right here in the middle of Wiyot territory, including Eureka, Arcata, McKinleyville. And so you're looking at a territory that is pretty significant to Humboldt County, and it is Wiyot territory, Wiyot country. I'm gonna show you a quick video that I think helps to kind of contextualize California history in a really great way. And I have to say thank you to all the people that are in the video and also the people that helped get it made. This video is made at Humboldt State University as part of the place-based learning communities. It was a chance for us because to give an introduction to California Indian history and Humboldt State. The place-based learning communities are first-year freshman learning communities for the science majors. So the College of Natural Resources and Sciences has their freshmen in certain classes together, and they follow this trajectory in a cohort style of learning. And one of the things that they have to do as part of that learning is take a Native American Studies class. When they put together place-based learning at Humboldt State, the thought process is you can't learn about your place if you don't learn about Indigenous peoples' histories, theories, and thoughts about the future. And so now, starting next year, a majority of the incoming science freshmen for Humboldt State are going to be taking a Native American Studies class as part of their first year experience. And this video is something that we show to them to help them get oriented to this region. It doesn't cover everything, but it gives you a good idea of the ways in which we understand how our histories inform our present, but also will help us to build really strong futures. So I'm going to play it for you now and then talk a little bit afterwards. For California Indian history specifically, I think it's important for people to know that California has always been a populous place. It's home right now to 109 to 111 tribes, but back then you're talking about tribes everywhere. There is no empty space of wilderness that exists in this place that we currently call California. The way you know that there were California Indians everywhere is that every place had a name. There was not a mountain or a field or a region that there wasn't a tribe who had already named it. For the sciences, I think that the land bridge theory has always been sort of a first point of knowledge about Native people. But there have been new studies that have shown that there was humans in this side of the Americas over 100,000 years ago, which would mean that that is around the same amount of time in which they say people were sort of first leaving Africa. And so we are asking people to complicate how they understand who we are as Indigenous peoples here. What we say is we're from this place.
That's a real and true belief that we have. We are a part of the land and the land is us, and we didn't migrate from some other place. We've always been there.
We've always been a part of our land and not above it, not below it, but equal to, and we have our role. Our roles come from that engagement and come from seeing what needs to be done to make things the best way that they can be.
So all of this is very important for people to understand, because I think sometimes they think Californian people are here, but they're not really doing much with the space. There's so much evidence of like agriculture. There's evidence of large areas in which they're tending to. There's evidence of ways in which they're shaping what we now think of the natural landscape. And then colonization happens. Most California scholars, they call it invasion. So we're being invaded.
When Cabrillo was first on one of his ships in 1500s, burning of the land is what actually gave away people on that land. That was like the first thing that, colonizers saw, was our traditional burnings of the lands.
You're talking about 3 waves of destruction. From the start of these waves, there's not really a time period in which California Indians can recover from what's happening to them. So the first wave of destruction is the Spanish mission system. They build the first mission in San Diego. There's 21 missions that they build in total. This is Father Junipero Serra. And they're bringing people into the missions in the hopes that they can create this labor force to be able to establish this extension of Spain. The mission system is effectively an enslavement system of California Indian people. The missionaries bring along with them Spanish soldiers. The soldiers are written about in these records as being perpetrators of sexual violence, not only against women, but also children. Junipero Serra actually talks about that in his journals. He's like, they are sexually assaulting women and children in front of people. And when people try to stop them, they get shot. I mean, it's a very violent type of situation. The mission system sort of stops around San Francisco. And so up here in Northern California, what they say about us is we were contacted relatively late in the sort of colonization cycle. We had contact with some explorers who had come through, people that were looking mostly for gold. And at a point they find gold. And this is where you get these sort of like massive influx of the gold rush.
And it just came like overnight, and it came in hard. And life just changed drastically and just immediately in a lot of ways for California people.
They're not here so that they can set up a colony or so that they can establish a labor force. They want gold. They will kill whoever is in the way. They will take apart whatever needs to be taken apart. They'll do whatever it takes. The thing about the gold rush that people don't think about is that it was actually an environmental destruction as well. And then on top of that, they are setting up a political system and a state system of laws and governance that will legalize the genocide that they want to commit against California Indian people.
Our first Lieutenant Governor, Peter Burnett, saw this huge population of Indians in the state. And so he's the one that, charged the war of extermination on the California Indians. And we lost, probably around 80% of our total population. It's just a short period of years.
The early settlers wanted the resources. They wanted what would make them rich faster.
But instead of asking the tribe to help them or assist them, they said, well, since tribe probably won't just give to us, we're just going to wipe them out. We're going to massacre them. We're going to take everything for ourselves.
Each region of California is allowed to set their own sort of, what are we going to pay for a scalp or a head? But when you look at advertisements, what you see is that they're advertising them at things like $5 a head and 25 cents per scalp. The first year that they do this, they pay $1 million. The state of California says that it has paid $1 million for killing Indian people. The second year they do it, it's $1 million. In this region, every single tribe in this region would have some kind of stories about the violence that came out of the gold rush. My great-grandfather, you know, his family is from Cutcha country. His great uncle his mom had lived through the gold rush, and he was born sort of like at the tail end of this period of time. And he would always say to my mother, you know, remember, granddaughter, you're here because some miner was a bad shot. Like, that's how close it is to who we are.
When modern contact, we had to forget about all our relations. We had to forget about all the sciences, and we had to forget about all the philosophies. We had to forget about everything that was ingrained from us for thousands of years to a shattered existence.
They would take your kids from your family and take them to boarding schools. And then suddenly you were not to practice your cultures. You're not to practice your traditions. You're supposed to practice, you know, I hate to say it this way, the white man's religion. We're going to Christianize you. You're going to follow our God.
I know that I'm a product of forced assimilation. I know I was stripped of some of the smartest information a human being could have. And I know I don't have that now. But I know it's attainable over time. And we're on the right path.
There's all these great moments of Native people making sure that they were trying to hold on to things, like fighting back and making plans for the future. It's palpable in Humboldt County.
The Native American community, and especially the Weats and the surrounding tribes, were put through a lot. It wasn't just the Weats, it was Huron, Hoopa, we were all put through a lot during the early years. Here we are, we're growing, we're becoming a stronger nations. We're working together with each other to create a positive thing. And not only us working with each other's sister tribes, we're working with the cities, the governments that surround us, the schools, HSU, to make this more positive.
Humboldt State University is within the Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot people. And then we have several other large tribes around here, the three largest in California, the Karuk, the Yurok, and the Hoopa. So being that we are in the backyard of three of the largest tribes, we can draw off and partner with some of our local tribes to bring that extra educational component to our STEM and natural resource students. Here, the Indian Natural Resource Science and Engineering Program and Diversity in STEM, we go by Intercept Plus. Our services generally provide navigational suggestions to students, assisting them navigate the College of Natural Resources and Sciences. We often are enriching that experience with extracurricular activities coming from an Indigenous perspective. So bringing up our ancestors' practices and techniques of managing landscapes, melding them or braiding them in with the scientific method and innovative technologies.
In Native studies, we're doing a sort of broad spectrum of what it's like to learn from Indigenous peoples and cultures and knowledges so that we can build a better world, build a better way of knowing. It's about how we learn with and from Native people instead of disciplines historically that have focused on the study of Native American people. My paternal grandmother was one of the founders of the Indian Tribal Education Personnel Program, the ITEP, back in the late 60s and early 70s. Her and a bunch of other mothers and grandmothers, they were the ones that kind of started a lot of our other community programs, our healthcare programs, our education programs. I always think it's a pretty amazing story because a lot of those women, her included, had attended boarding schools. And for those women to come back from that and still understand that we needed health and we needed education and we needed a strong community.
When you talk about the Indian Tribal Educational Personnel Program and United Indian Health Services having these women with moxie, they come from a generation of women who have been having to just hold that strength for such a long time. And part of the work as tribal people is how do we go back and tap into that? Because that's always there. We come from a long line of those folks who are moving forward and have had to keep their dignity, keep their pride. And although it hurts, we're still doing that work. That's what I try to tap in for the young people, tribal people in particular, but also for non-Indian students to hear that too. That it's not all historical trauma and then we're gone. No, it's historical trauma. We're still here and we're not going anywhere. We're still learning, we're still enduring.
I think the thing that I hope that people get out of the video most often when we show it is that the story of California Indian people and our histories is not just about the attempted genocide of us, but it is about our ability to get through that and the fact that we are still here and that we're doing amazing things as California Indian people and that we have had unbroken connections to our histories and our lands and our cultures that have really sort of sustained us as we've moved forward. A couple of things to point out from the video in case it's the first time you're seeing it. The first is that when we're talking about California Indian history and this genocide, this attempted genocide, a lot of California Indian scholars refer to it as the end of the world. And they're really looking at the idea that what is happening at that time to California Indians is nothing short of an apocalypse. It's a reduction of the population. Scholar Sherburne Cook says that he estimates the death of Native peoples between 1770 and 1900 to be about 90% of the original population. And he explains this in 3 waves. So he's looking at the Spanish missions, the end of the missions and the rancho system, and then the gold rush. What's important and what he notes is that during this time between 1769 and ongoing, you're not talking in these 3 waves of destruction, you're not talking about a time when California Indians could recover from what's happening to them. These come one right after the other. And each one of them is bent on the destruction of California Indian people. And so you're looking at 3 different times where people are trying to destroy the population, which is why you see such a massive reduction of Native people during this period of time. What's also important to note about these 3 ways of destruction is that this effort to eradicate California Indian people included passing laws that legalized volunteer militias to go after Native American scalps and heads, laws that legalized the kidnapping and selling and enslavement of California Indian people, which tended to be like women and children, laws that prevented Native people from leaving the reservation through threats of being shot on sight. And you're looking at like the state government at the time is making efforts to support the killing of California Indian people. So this is Governor Peter Burnett, January 7th, 1851, saying in his speech that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. So he's calling for the genocide of California Indian people. The genocide is then legalized and supported by laws that the state government passes, including the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which allowed for the enslavement of California Indian people as quote unquote apprentices. And it actually started what was a slave trade system in California. So though California entered the Union as a no slave state, they allowed for the enslavement of California Indian people. At the same time, they passed the California Volunteer Militia, where they pay money for scalps and heads, and they authorize expenses for people who are doing, who are going against the Indians. This is actually one of the first acts that the legislature passes. Another thing to consider is that this is not that the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, sometimes people will think what this means is that people are taking like adults into slavery for labor purposes. But when you look through the records, especially in Humboldt County, what you see is that the majority of people being enslaved during this period of time are children, ages 7 to 12. And of those children, most of those are girls. And so we need to look at the fact that they're trading in young Indian girls who get the most money paid for them during this period of time. At the same time, they're also enacting what Chisa Oros in her master's thesis here at Humboldt State refers to as an ecocide. And so they're really going after the land and the environment. During the gold rush in Northern California, gold miners dug up approximately 12 billion tons of earth. The sediment then gathers, and they treated the sediment with mercury. And so they're pouring mercury into the waters and onto the land in order to get at flecks of gold. They also try to destroy the environment. So they begin clear cutting old growth forests, which result in soil collapse. They have this, they sort of go after all of the wildlife. They start killing wildlife without consideration of the impact that that's going to have. They overfish. So they will take thousands of fish at the same time out of the water. And then they also start to pour mercury into the water, which then bioaccumulates in the species of most of the waterways in Northern California. So to this day, we have mercury present in our waters that comes from the gold rush. They blow mountains up and pour that sediment into the river. They set whole villages on fire. The methods lead to habitat loss and destruction for wildlife, and also to the accumulating deaths of California Indian people who are fleeing this ecocide, this environmental genocide, as well as the genocide. Gold ends up proving much less profitable than people thought. And so because of that, people start to try to seize land and property because they're not making money off of the gold rush. And they start to try to remove Indians by any means possible. And this is where you see lands being taken from people in very violent ways, disappearing people, burning people out of their homes. And you're looking at how people are then claiming land and water rights based on the fact that they are killing people and then getting access to those lands. Many of the landowners who have deeds in California who are from these old families will often trace their rights to their land and water back to the gold rush. And they'll have deeds that they say, look, I have this deed that says it belongs to me or it belongs to my family. And that deed will have been written during this period of time where they are killing Indian people to get at that land. When we talk about the brutality of this history, what I think about most is how much it is palpable to contemporary California Indian peoples. And so I'm a California Indian person, a scholar, a mother, a daughter, a friend, a professor, a community advocate. And when I do this work, I realize that I really live it in my body. And I think it's important to start to talk about this because I know that other people on this live stream who are listening to this are also California Indian people. And I want you to know that like we see you and we know that the work you do is hard and it comes from a place of great love. love for like our people and our futures and our children and our elders. And that even now, when we start to think about the impact of colonialism on the environment, what's happening right now where people are saying that they're going to prioritize profits and economy over our peoples and our lives, and how that can make you feel, because we've lived this in our bodies, because our histories are written in who we are. I read accounts in the archives right now of children hiding in trees during the gold rush and having to remain silent as they listened to the sounds of their family being killed. There are those who hid in the waters amongst the reeds and rivers and were told not to come out until the river didn't run red with blood anymore. I cry sometimes when I do this work, and I will go home and I will hug my daughter and I'll just hold her so tight, because I start to think about, like, what would I have done if they tried to rip her from my arms and take her from me? Is something that we have to acknowledge as California Indian people, that when we think about this history, it's real to us, and we need to remember that. So I talked a little bit in the video about my great grandfather. This is him, Swarm David Risling Sr. And he actually wrote, he has a number of things that he wrote, because he was born at the tail end of the gold rush, and he lived through this period of time of great upheaval. And he had heard stories firsthand from his family about what happened to them. And one of the things that he wrote was, the Karuks received the most cruel treatment by the miners, killing males, taking their wives and daughters, setting fires to their homes, destroying their villages, taking their land for mining claims, and leaving no records or history to tell the story, but the scars are still there. But he also, because he was like a very prolific person, and one of the things that he always comes back to in his writing is helping us as Native people to understand what that means for us. Like, yes, that happened, but what does that mean for us? And one of the quotes I love from him that he left behind was, "I have learned through my life that we are highly civilized, that of which will never be equaled. The civilization that is patterned from the materials that kills human lives is poorly civilized." And I think that for me, this quote sticks with me very much even today. The civilization that is patterned from the materials that kills human lives is poorly civilized. And that we as Indigenous peoples can come in and remind people and tell people and demand of people something better for our futures than what people think is supposed to happen or what people think is always going to happen. I know, I hope, and I'm going to take a moment here just very specifically to talk to people who are on this live stream right now, who are doing this work in their communities, who are thinking about the time that we're in right now and wondering, like, what do we do and how do we talk about our resiliency when we are all so very tired, and when it can feel almost too big and too heavy. I know that the work that we do can feel heavy. A lot of the times the work that I do feels heavy because it feels mostly about death. And we start to repeat statistics about things like the violence that's committed against us or our bodies and the attempts to give up our futures. And we think only about the death that is coming. The stories that people tell about us, the books that people have written have tended to be about our deaths, not our lives, not our futures, not our present struggles against the settler colonial system that refuses to imagine our futures as sovereign nations within this nation. But instead, these best-selling books have been about our genocide, the violence enacted on our bodies. They make spectacle of our deaths, and then they deny it in their history. And so I remind us to be mindful not to become merely spectacle of death again, but instead to remember our resurgence and our revitalization. It is important to understand our genocidal history. I understand that. I think about the nuance of that a lot, but I want to talk about us in complex ways that acknowledges that we are more than what settlers have written about us in archives, more than the documentation of our death. Because I think about how through all of this, how we must have laughed and loved and dreamed and imagined a future. I think about our ancestors and how they dreamed all the time, and how they loved each other and how they loved us, and what that love would do to sustain them, how they would hold each other, the ways that they would pass on anything to us, snippets, just small things that they could carry. So the work that I have done in my scholarship has been to look at the revitalization of things that we have done ceremonially. And the book that I wrote was about the revitalization of women's coming of age ceremonies specifically. When we worked with our community to revitalize our women's ceremony, we only found it in parts. And we had heard stories about ancestors who would say things like, I can't remember everything, but I remember this. I remember a song, a prayer, a story. And I'll carry that forward to the next generation. And I thought about how they planned for us and they knew that we would be here. And so they carried anything that they could forward. They didn't think of themselves as dying or sad or vanishing Indians. They knew they were going to survive and they knew they had to remember so that we could dance and sing and laugh and love. And I don't want to just think about us as our genocide. I want us to start talking about who we have always been, and as Leanne Simpson says, what we have always done. I think it's time for Indigenous voices to be the loudest, to shake the ground that we walk on, to make this earth again whole. So when I think about who's been doing this work already, it's us, it's Indigenous peoples. We are the ones who've been doing the cultural and linguistic and knowledge revitalization and resurgence. We are the ones who won't let genocide define us. We are the ones that talk about resistance and resurgence and unbroken relationships to land and histories and cultures. And I think about this every single day because our history is one of renewal and resurgence and laughter and dirty jokes and a lot of hope and strength. Our stories are carved in our DNA, where we end always with hope, so sure of who we are because we need to tell those stories, because we need to remember who we are. They tried to take from us our future and our generations, but we are still here. They tried to erase our presence from this land, but we're still here. They tried to turn us into mascots and caricatures. They flooded our sacred sites. They denied us access to our sacred places. They brought us before a colonial system of justice. They have imprisoned us at higher rates than any group of people in the United States. They have tried to take from us our history. They've tried to reduce us to numbers and statistics, to divorce us from stories, to divorce us from each other. But you cannot convince me that we were not the people who knew that we would hold on. So I tell people today, like when you think about our history, remember to write your own stories and be your voices. And don't let anyone tell you that the work that you're doing doesn't matter, or it's too biased, or it has too many harsh words, because the work you do matters. And I marvel at the strength of our people to do this work, despite the fact that it has been so hard and continues to be so hard. And people keep wanting to think that this world, the way that it is right now, this settler colonial government and system, this ability for people to think that the way that they think and they're telling us to think right now is the way that everybody thinks. We know what we can do to make a difference. And I think about what we do in our communities to make that happen. So I work with Two Feathers, and if you haven't heard about the ACORN program over here, with youth, because I think it's our youth that we have to remind that they have all the power in the world to imagine a better future and to enact that future in a way that really matters. And I want to let everybody know that in my own work, I center youth specifically because to me, they have some of the best visions for the future, and nobody's told them that it can't happen yet. And I think we can get our best ideas from them about moving forward and to remember that what we're doing is for them. I know that the work that we do as Indigenous peoples on history is really important. And so you have my book and the ways in which I approach this idea of like understanding our revitalization as what's been centered. You have the work we're doing in the ACORN program through Two Feathers, which brings together elders with youth and community members with youth to think about like the impacts of our cultural programs and practices on mental health and how they're going to sort of develop in their futures. You have work that has been done by scholar Keishan Lara-Cooper, Comtem, which is a collection of essays about the importance of like our culture to how we heal and how we move forward. You have work by KCET, Tending Nature, a series that talks about the ways Indigenous peoples are continuing traditional ecological knowledge. You have the Native Women's Collective that is really looking at how we can revitalize arts and culture, continue a process of that revitalization. And the Native Cultures Fund at Humboldt Area Foundation that helps to look at how can we get money back into Indigenous communities in a way that helps to support what they really want to do, which is to say that our culture is what's going to heal us. And so I look forward to the future that we're building. And I just want to remind everybody that while the history can be very heavy, I admire you for the work that you continue to do. I hope that in this time where we're trying to figure all this out, we can all remember that out of our songs and our ceremonies and our ability to remember that this is our land, that we can reconnect in a way that really matters and build better futures. So that's it for me today. Ooh, let's see. I'm gonna try to go back. I don't know how to do that. Stop share.
There we go.
All right.
Go talk, Cutcha. It always gives me chills hearing that type of talk over and over again. Now we're going to go into our question and answers segment. So we have a couple right now, but feel free to ask questions. We have a little bit more time. I think we still have like a half an hour, but we'll try to keep it short. The first question is from Florence Parks. How does the ownership of land change our people?
I think it sort of depends, because right now, most of the land in the United States is owned by the federal government or the state government. So governments own a majority of the land right now. And I think that when you're starting to talk about how we can return land to Indigenous peoples, to me, that looks like returning land in a way that honors that Indigenous people's relationship to land. It's something bigger than just ownership and putting fences around it. And so you need to be able to say, like, in honoring the return of land, we're going to honor the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples to decide what that looks like and how that is enacted and managed. And I know that there will be a lot of work to make that happen. I'm not saying that this is a 2-year-long project. I'm saying that this is the project we should be working on all the time. And it's going to take a long time, but it's going to be so amazing when it does happen.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I always think of when I think of like ownership of land is just having access to those traditional resources, you know, whether that's nutritional, whether that's medicinal, whether that's practical, you know, I think that's the biggest part about ownership. I don't think anyone really even considered it as an owner. It's more of just a caretaker. And I think that's something really important to think about, is once that is repatriated or regoverned, that then we'll have more access in health and social health, mental health, nutritional health. And so I think that's something that really is important. Speaking of which, a question that Frankie Tripp had asked was, are the huckleberries sprayed at Humboldt State? Do we know?
You know, I don't know for sure. I actually don't think that they are. And we're working right now at HSU and NAS on what we're calling a food sovereignty lab. And we're looking at the ways in which we can start to utilize the plants that are on campus, especially the native plants, as part of this food sovereignty lab. And so we're going to start working with facilities specifically on how we can start using those plants. And I haven't heard from anyone yet that they're sprayed and that they're concerned about that.
And there's another question from Virgil Moorhead Jr. How does the flower dance assist with community development and specifically help with the development of our Native youth?
For me, I figured out a lot about that with the work that we did. So one of the things that I did was interview young women who have been through the dance so that they could talk about their experience. What I always say about learning about this women's coming of age ceremony is Native people were really the first developmental psychologists. They were looking at the importance of adolescence and what happens during that period of time and how they could connect adolescents to community and then empower adolescents, rather than sort of what we do right now in adolescence, where we kind of tell people there's something wrong with them or something bad is happening. It's empowering young people to think about how they can now move into a different phase in their life and into adulthood. And there's so many moments within that ceremony that really show you how culture is trying to teach you about connecting to people, family, history, and also the methodologies that we have, things like medicines and sweats and running and how you eat, to help you to develop into a full person, and not leaving you alone in that, not thinking that people will figure it out, but instead saying your community is part of how you're going to grow up. and your community is there for you, and you are not alone, and you have these people that care about you and care about your place. I actually think the more work that I do on it, the more I'm seeing how it connects to pushing back against things like suicidal ideation, right? Because like you're never alone, you're never without people. Pushing back against this idea that somehow there should be a stratification between like girls and boys, and instead saying we're actually a community, we come together and support each other. Empowering people by teaching them how to sing and how to speak and how to talk. And I see so much growth in what happens in the young people that are able to do these ceremonial practices that I actually think Native people were thinking about that from the beginning, but I also don't see how we move forward with any type of practices in our communities without really centering the fact that we have in our ceremonies a lot of really good methods for how you can work with young people.
I think that's something that's important in Indian history in California, especially, is just how intentional, the colonizers were on kind of dehumanizing our women, because they understood the significance and the role of our women in our communities. And so I think that's something that has been stripped of us. And, the efforts that Two Feathers has as far as kind of rekindling that relationship with the flower dance and other activities that kind of rekindle, the way that our kids view themselves and view each other. Because I think in this society today, with the influence of Facebook, Instagram, all these different social media websites, I think can kind of alter that perspective as far as like their self-worth and their sense of belonging. And so I think that is very important about the programming that we do at Two Feathers, as well as the stick games for the boys. I think that's something that they're really passionate about, where they could express themselves. And especially when you have kids who are suffering from the impacts of colonialism, who have the tendency to outburst, and that's socially unacceptable. Whereas on the stick field, I think that's encouraged, and it allows them to express themselves without being punished. So I think that's a big part of it as well. So there's a couple other questions that are coming in. Is the video presented available to share with others?
The video is actually on YouTube. If you search PBLC California History or Humboldt California History, it should come up. I will say that we try to ask people, if they're going to show it, that they either get in touch with us. We're working on a statement that people can read as part of the video. We want to be clear with the video that if you're going to use it, that you're able to leave space for some type of discussion, or a way for people to reflect on the fact that we want people to move beyond, oh my gosh, this is such shocking information, I'm very sad, I don't know what to do with this, to, wow, look at the resiliency, the revitalization, the re-indigenization happening in these communities. Let's focus on that part as well. And so we're working on that statement, but right now the video is available. And if you decide to show it anywhere publicly, we'd like to know, because we also like to keep track of where it goes and what people are doing with it.
Mm-hmm. And then Frankie Tripp asked another really good question. Any advice on starting youth programs in other areas? I love seeing what Two Feathers is doing. How do I collaborate and follow that model? I feel like that's a really good question, and I think about that all the time, coming from rural location of Soames Bar, similar to where you grew up, Frankie. And we're doing our best. We're getting there. I think a lot of what we're doing as of now was like community engagement dinners, and having a couple of our workers going out there and just kind of engaging with the community, starting that relationship. And but it is one of the future goals of the organization, is to kind of have sister branches out there in those rural isolated places. So then then it becomes even more accessible to the people who we're trying to focus on the most. But we'll keep you in touch as far as any other type of ways we could kind of give you a pragmatic approach to having that model be used in your own way. Okay, another question. Coming from a California Indian community very tied to the mission since assimilation, it's almost a seen as a revolt or being a rebel to embrace my culture, traditions, and language. Have you had similar experiences? How do you react, communicate to those relatives who embrace the missions about decolonization? That's from Emily Chan.
I do think that, I think we have to remember that these systems, what happened in the Spanish mission system, what happened in the ranchero system and in the gold rush, they were very deliberate in trying to separate and make sure that people would not return to their cultures and to their histories. And it was through, you can only do that. That can only happen through extreme violence. And so there's so much violence that's tied to the mission system, to the ranchero system and the gold rush, because people don't give up their land and their cultures and their families and their children without violence. And that violence we're still working through and healing from, and that trauma is carried in us. And it's why I think when we're starting to talk about who we're going to be in the future, like when we approach people in our own communities, I think you have to do it with great care and model for them the importance of what you're doing. Do it for you, do it for like your family, model for your own like nieces and nephews and children, your grandchildren, like why it's important to you. Model for everybody else, and people will find their way. I don't know if you can lecture them into doing it. I don't know if you can like beg them to do it, but people will show up for their young people especially. And so when we did the flower dance, for instance, in some cases there were families where the girl really wanted it, and there were older generations that were saying, this is not something that we do, and we actually think that celebrating a young woman when she starts her menstruation is not right, and we have this history and we're not okay with it. And the girl had to kind of step up in her own self and say, all right, but I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to model for you what I'm doing. I'm going to be the person I am. And what you notice is that a lot of those family members showed up for her. Even if it wasn't their thing, they showed up for her because that's what they could see the connection to, is the person that they love. So I think the best thing to do is to remember, like, I'm modeling for people who I think we could be. I'm helping them to find their way home, because there is a lot of history as to why that's not happening. And I know sometimes it's like you get upset or angry, or you just want people to get it. But I think what I've seen is that in moments, people will step up in the way that they know how. And those moments really matter too. And they're steps forward. And like I said, we're in this long term. So if we're taking baby steps forward, I think we're going to be okay.
Okay, that's really well said. So I think that's all the questions, unless I'm missing some. I think we're good as far as the questions go. So yeah, thank you, Cutcha, for the wise words. It's always really interesting. I always learn something new. Even have had you as a teacher for the last 3 years. I think that's really important. And so I guess that kind of concludes today's event, today's speaker series. So again, Cutcha Yotwa for what you had to offer us. Next week, we're going to have our second event, which will be featuring Lauren Bomelin of the Talawadini Nation. So that's going to be really exciting. We'll have more details about that coming up. But other than that, continue to be on the lookout of different things that Two Feathers is doing. We have a YouTube channel now. I think that's one of the ways that we're kind of adapting to the crisis that we're in. It is titled Two Feathers -NAFS. And so I think that'll be important. This video will be shared there, and it's going to kind of be the starter of what we have to offer, so that it's accessible for not just the time of the live video, but also throughout time. I think that's one way to adapt as Indigenous people, is just the accessibility of information to people who can't always be here at the time of the talk. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you guys stay safe out there. Again, social distancing is important in these times. I know it's hard. We love hanging out with each other, but we have video cameras, we have phones we can call. It's not always how it used to be. So I think we're pretty grateful in that sense. All righty. Thanks again. Have a good one out there.